prove evolution occurred as opposed to mere natural selection within a species or kind. Did you get that one? I'm not sure I did. Let me read it again. Are there any intermediate life forms, fossils, in the geologic record that prove evolution actually occurred as opposed to mere natural selection within a species or kind?
Oh, definitely. There are intermediate types that, but I flinch at this proof again because of my early introduction. Remember, proofs are based on mathematics. So what we have for evolution is massive amounts of evidence. We do not have proof. Proofs are confined to the hard sciences of physics and chemistry. We have evidence. We have Archaeopteryx, which is a form intermediate between the ancestral bird and our modern birds. We have intermediates. We have therapsids that are ancestral to the mammals. We have many intermediate forms between ancestral forms and modern forms.
Sorry, I can't figure these things out either.
All right. Intermediate fossils. I would say, without question, there have never been any discovered that are verifiable. Only 5 Archaeopteryx fossils have been found, only 3 with a head, only 1 was sectioned. Archaeopteryx is 100% bird, nothing more than an extinct type of bird. It had claws on its wings, so does the ostrich today, so does the Hoatzin in South America. It had long tail vertebrae, so does a swan, tail vertebrae identical to a swan's vertebrae. Archaeopteryx had a shallow breastbone, so does the Hoatzin in South America because of its large crop. It's a leaf eater. Archaeopteryx was nothing but a bird. If it was intermediate, it would certainly take an awful lot more than one intermediate step to go from a reptile to a bird. Reptiles have solid bones, birds have hollow bones. Reptiles have a 3-chambered heart, birds have a 4-chambered heart. They have a totally different reproductive system. Reptiles are covered by scales, birds are covered by feathers. Feathers are very different than a scale if you've ever seen the two. There are multitudes of differences, and it would take certainly more than one step. And the one they always point to is Archaeopteryx, and I can show you quotes by many of the most famous evolutionists who will say, no, Archaeopteryx is not a missing link. It's just an extinct species of bird. It had teeth in its beak, so did the Hesperornis and a few other extinct birds. No known birds today have teeth in their beak. But going from teeth to no teeth is not an improvement, it's a loss. That's not an example of an improving of the species. Just like going from a monkey with a tail to a man without a tail would certainly not be an improvement. A tail would be very handy to hold your Coke while you're driving your car.
Okay, Dr. Hovind, you get to start the next one. I think. Is that where we're at? Okay. Did the atmosphere originally have oxygen in it? If it did, would that not bind with the precursors of life, making original spontaneous generation of life? If it did not have oxygen in it, I assume, would not the UV radiation snuff all life originally formed?
Complicated question. The original atmosphere apparently has always had oxygen. The only reason they came up with the reducing atmosphere with the experiments from Urey and Miller and those fellas was they knew that if there were oxygen, it would destroy the life that it created. It would oxidize and couldn't survive in the presence of oxygen. Dr. Richardson said that the oxygen in our atmosphere is a result of life producing this oxygen. There's an awful lot of oxygen on the Earth. I believe it's the second most abundant element on the Earth. We have a little problem there with the development of these complex elements from simpler ones. We've never seen that happening. We see a number of elements that decay and get simpler. Nothing increases in complexity. That's never been observed. You can't change it to anything more complex. So I would say the Earth has always had an oxygen in the atmosphere. Those that have studied the deeper strata rocks are finding oxygen there. There is oxidized iron found in nearly all layers of the so-called geologic column. But again, it goes back, if you assume the geologic column is true and you assume evolution has occurred and everything has to be interpreted in light of that evidence, the geologic column becomes the Bible to the evolutionist. Everything must fit the geologic column or the evidence is rejected. So that's the whole problem was Lyell and Hutton and Cuvier and Steno and some of those fellows who developed the geologic column. Many were creationists. Dr. Richardson's exactly right. I'm certainly not one of those who believes there were 4 catastrophes and 4 different creations. The creationists in the 1800s were simply wrong. They taught the fixity of the species. They taught there is no variation at all. They said if there are 240 different kinds of dogs, then God must have made 240 kinds of dogs. That was a mistake. That is not true. There is a tremendous amount of variation available in the genetic code. So the evolutionists overreacted to the creationists who were wrong, The evolutionists said, well, hey, all the finches that Darwin saw probably had a common ancestor. The creationists said, no, if there's 40 kinds of finches, then God made 40 kinds of finches. And the creationists of the 1800s were wrong. All Darwin's finches did have a common ancestor, and the ancestor was a finch. Yes, there is variation. Yes, there is speciation, but it stays within the same kind of animal. But the finch does not have the same ancestor as the tomato and the whale and the hamster.
Have you already had this one, or is it your turn?
I will need that question repeated.
Pardon?
I will need the question repeated.
Oh, dear.
I think it was about
Thanks a
oxygen.
lot.
Wasn't it about oxygen?
Did the atmosphere originally have oxygen in it? If it did, would that not bind with precursors of life, making original spontaneous generation of life? If it did not, would not the UV radiation, that means ultraviolet, snuff all life originally formed?
No. The initial atmosphere of the Earth did not have oxygen present. I cited the iron formation as one point of evidence on this behalf. And I wanted to reply to a couple points that Dr. Hovine brought up. First of all, there's a common misconception between the second theory, the second law of thermodynamics, disagreeing with evolution. The second law of thermodynamics says that in a closed system, the amount of disorder is constantly increasing. Disorder is not the same thing as complexity. So when we talk about complexity through evolutionary time, it has nothing to do with order versus disorder. A paramecium is every bit as ordered energetically, which is what the second law of thermodynamics talks about, as we are. So evolution does not fly in the face of the second law of thermodynamics. That is based on a misconception of the second law of thermodynamics. The second law is referring to the amount of usable energy. The amount of usable energy in the closed system that we call the universe is constantly decreasing. That has no bearing particularly on evolution.
Okay, next question, if you'll stay there. You continually use fossils as proof of evolution. Can you explain why we have tons of fossils of the organisms from which we evolved, and also tons of fossils to which what they evolved to? Let me try that again. Can you explain why we have tons of fossils of the organisms from which we evolved, and also tons of fossils of the organisms to which we evolved, I believe, but no fossils at all of intermediate organisms that must have existed over the long time span it takes to evolve? Example, ape, dash, 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 to man. Many fossils, man exists, but no intermediate. Why?
Intermediates do exist between our ancestors, which were not apes. We share an ancestor with apes, but apes are not our ancestor. And we have fossil evidence for many intermediates between that ancestor and us. We don't have intermediates between apes and ourselves because there would be none, because they are not our ancestors.